Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this presentation of the 30-year infrastructure strategy refresh. I'm Michel Masson, the CEO of Infrastructure Victoria, and I'm joined today by Jonathan, the Deputy CEO, and Llewellyn, our Director of Research and Economics. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the many lands and waterways on which we all are today, and pay my respect to their elders past and present and emerging leaders. What we'll do is that I'll do some pretty brief contextual remarks, and then Llewellyn will take us through the recommendations in detail. Before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping, please. If you could type any questions you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen and include your name and your organization. And please do remember that the session is being recorded and will be available online. So let's get started and share with you that 30-year infrastructure strategy refresh. So Llewellyn, if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so most of you will be familiar with who Infrastructure Victoria is. We undertake on a regular basis a 30-year infrastructure strategy tabled in Parliament. We provide advice to the Victorian Government on request on any infrastructure matters that they want us to work on, and we undertake some independent research on any topics that we see fit. The point I'd like to stress today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are an independent statutory authority. And what I mean by that is that our independence is embedded in the legislation which created us, whereby the minister cannot direct nor control the activities of Infrastructure Victoria. What that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that we are in a unique position to engage meaningfully and authentically with all of you, provide and publish transparently evidence that has never been shared before, to really be in a position to bring frank and fearless recommendations and advice to the Victorian Government on the decisions we feel they should really consider for the benefits of the Victorians in the future. And it is really this philosophy which we had at heart in the context of the 30-year infrastructure strategy. And what a journey that undertaking of the strategy has been. Next slide, please. We're very mindful that this is a refresh of the first ever 30-year infrastructure strategy, which was tabled in Parliament in 2016. We were certainly very pleased to see that out of the 137 recommendations tabled then in Parliament, to date, 123 have either been completed or in the process of being completed. This is a good place to start with. We've taken into consideration the challenges that we know we have, think congestion, climate change, aging population, but we've also considered the emerging trends, working from home, acceleration of digitization, shifts in travel pattern. We have recognized the progress that the Victorian Government has made, and especially the strong commitments made in the context of COVID. But we've also taken some consideration to what more needs to be done in the context of planning for a 30-year infrastructure strategy. So we've certainly taken all of those into consideration, planned with different scenarios, recognizing that the future is uncertain, and that means that we really need to take those different futures into account. And we've released our draft strategy in December to engage authentically with all of you and invite agnostically some counter evidence and make sure that what will be published ultimately and tabled in Parliament has got as many fingerprints from you as possible. This is not just our document, this is Team Victoria's document. So let's move on to the next slide to talk precisely about that consultation process. We've been blessed by your involvement all together inside the tent, really bringing together different views and looking at the draft recommendations that we have published then. We had more than 25,000 visits on our website. Ultimately, by talking or engaging with about 700 different people, we had 2,600 pieces of feedback, which the team did a real good job at looking at, analyzing and integrating when appropriate into the strategy. So next slide, please. Let's actually look at what are the key themes. The main point that I want to impress upon you, ladies and gentlemen, is that the final strategy doesn't present a wholesale change from what the draft strategy was, which to a certain extent is a good thing. But we've definitely integrated a lot of different pieces of feedback, put on some new recommendations, and of course, provided visibility on what was really new, which is that very innovative modeling tool we use to strategically assess in a completely different new way the major transport programs to compellingly come to you with some very strong recommendations. So what we've heard very clearly is a very strong support for what has been the approach of Infrastructure Victoria since we started in 2016, which is, let's look at how we manage the demand. Let's actually make the most of the existing assets that we've got before we consider the new build. And I would argue that there's never been a better time right now and in the foreseeable future to really look at how we make the most of the existing assets. This is an absolute key theme of our 30-year strategy. We've also had some very strong support in regards to active and public transport infrastructure, social housing, which we've always considered as an absolute key infrastructure that deserves attention and ongoing funding, but also looking at the vulnerable Victorians and a much stronger attention to the traditional owners in infrastructure planning in the context of this strategy than we had in the final strategy. So these are just examples of what changes we brought. But let's now hear from Llewellyn in regards to what this strategy is actually all about. Over to you, Llewellyn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michel. And look, I'm very aware we've put out a lot of documents last week, and there's many, many hundreds of pages of material for you to explore and read at your leisure. I'm going to try and condense that into about 15 minutes, so bear with me because I'm going to zip through and give you a quick overview of the content of the strategy, so leave us as much time as possible to answer your questions. So firstly, you're looking at the main themes of Victoria's Infrastructure Strategy 2021 to 2051. And I'm going to go through each of these very quickly in a moment. But what I want to draw your attention to is we've deliberately taken an integrated and cross-sectoral approach to producing this strategy. So you won't see headings here saying public transport, roads, social housing, energy, water. Instead, we've actually looked at the challenges that Victoria faces and tried to put together and aspired to produce an integrated strategy that looks not only at specific infrastructure types, but actually how infrastructure can work together in an integrated way to produce the outcomes Victoria is seeking to achieve. So our first theme is confronting long-term challenges. And I have to say, something that occupied us since our 2016 strategy was the state government's legislative objective to reach net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that's caused us to make a number of new recommendations and a number of revised recommendations, taking that target into account. We also think about some of the other consequences of climate change as well, including our adaptation challenge in terms of, particularly water supply, coastal erosion, and other threats from climate change. But it's not only climate change challenges we've considered in this section, we're also thinking about the impacts of technology and also the opportunities to build a circular economy and considering our use and recycling of products over their life cycle. So very quickly, some of the recommendations we've made in this area include accelerating the uptake of zero emissions vehicles. And what we've put in this final strategy is a recommendation that the state government set a deadline for the phasing out of internal combustion engine vehicles, and that be done up until 2035 at the latest. We've also made a number of recommendations about aligning our energy transmission infrastructure with new renewable generation infrastructure, because it's critical those two come online in a coordinated way over time to maximise the uptake of renewable energy, but also to ensure we are getting the most efficient use of our new energy transmission infrastructure. We've also seen a critical part of the transition being energy efficiency, and we've made a number of recommendations to particularly continue to modify our building stock so that it runs more efficiently in the future, because the energy we don't use is the cleanest energy we have, and will also help our transition occur faster and more smoothly. The final energy area we've looked at is gas infrastructure. It's actually currently a piece of advice that we're doing for the Victorian government, but we have kind of foreshadowed the outcomes of that advice by recommending that the Victorian government map out the transition pathway for gas infrastructure. But more broadly, we think that the Victorian government should do more to build climate change into its infrastructure decision making, and particularly we've made a number of recommendations about decision making in the water sector, recognising that population growth is continuing to put pressure on our water supplies at the same time that climate change is potentially reducing the amount of water available. Similarly, in terms of natural disasters, we are particularly interested in how we recover and respond to natural disasters, including using those opportunities to build back better and think about not merely replacing like for like, but in fact building more resilient infrastructure, or indeed building in different places in the future. We also make recommendations about how to adapt to changing coastlines and coastal erosion. Finally, we make a number of recommendations about using new technology, and we think there are lots of opportunities in our transport system and in our health and justice systems where we can use technology to get better outcomes and indeed minimise the amounts of infrastructure we need to build. Along the same lines, we can use technology and investment in new waste infrastructure to improve our waste and recycling capabilities and achieve far higher rates of recycling and move increasingly towards a circular economy. Moving to our second theme, and I guess something we are deeply aware of and have been talking about for a long time, is the integration of land use and infrastructure planning. And we very much see the shaping of our cities and the way we build our cities and modify them in the future will be a critical issue, both environmentally, economically, and socially in the future. So we've made a number of recommendations in this space, including doing more and particularly doing transparent public planning of infrastructure to allow us to have a great foundation for better integration of land use and infrastructure planning. We've also made a recommendation about reforming infrastructure contributions so we can more fairly, but also more clearly, identify some of the resources which can fund additional infrastructure in the future. We've looked very much at how we distribute growth and population in the future, particularly around encouraging more diverse housing options, both potentially denser housing in some locations and the construction of social housing to meet a diversity of social needs in our future cities. We've looked at open space in our cities and particularly made a couple of recommendations about valuing and promoting the use of open space and building our tree canopies, and particularly aligning that with some of our active transport infrastructure, including better walking and cycling infrastructure. We've made recommendations about the tram network and noting the particular role that the tram network plays in inner Melbourne. We think there are opportunities to leverage that infrastructure to continue to build better urban environments in inner Melbourne. We also look at about how to better use some of our existing infrastructure. So one of those strategies is looking at how we use our road space and look for opportunities to change the way we use road space, both for better movement patterns in our transport network and for better place-based outcomes in communities, recognising that road space actually is a large component of community land and can achieve a number of different place objectives as well as transport objectives. We've looked at how we can manage demand on our transport infrastructure, and particularly considering some of the pricing options that can help shift demand to both modes and times of day that have spare capacity. So we're making sure that our transport infrastructure is working to its greatest capacity as much as we can. And finally, we've made some recommendations about asset management and about ensuring we are upgrading and renewing our infrastructure to keep it modern and meet the contemporary needs of communities. Our third theme is around harnessing infrastructure for productivity and growth. And this is particularly around having efficient transport networks, efficient freight networks, and ensuring that the growth of social infrastructure is meeting the needs of growing communities. So we've made infrastructure in particularly looking at our bus network. We think there are a lot of opportunities for a new, renewed, next generation bus network, which can actually provide cost-effective and efficient transport public networks for use in the future. I will come to some of our major transport projects in a minute, but I also want to talk to some of our freight work. So we have a section dedicated to freight and really looking to build a freight network that can connect our ports, our airports, and our interfreight terminals by both road and rail to make sure we have got the most efficient freight networks, which can help support the productivity of our economy and particularly ensure our manufacturers and logistics sectors can get products to market most efficiently. We also look at a lot of our social infrastructure and particularly how we both adapt that infrastructure to meet modern service needs, as well as keep up with the demand for social infrastructure as population grows. So we've made a number of recommendations about planning and designing and building new social infrastructure in an environment where we're doing that alongside the service planning that needs to occur, so that we're building infrastructure and maintaining infrastructure that accommodates the types of services and the locations of services we want to have in the future. We also have a dedicated section to growth areas, and I guess a number of people have been very vocal about their concerns about infrastructure in growth areas. And one of our recommendations has been to dedicate a clear body with responsibility to oversight the rollout of infrastructure in growth areas, so we can make sure that government is fully informed and has kind of long-term budget oversight of the rollout needs of growth communities, and that can be incorporated into government decision making. And finally, we're very aware in growth areas of some of the particular needs around certain types of growth area infrastructure. We've made a new recommendation in this final strategy about libraries and aquatic centres in growth areas, and also made recommendations about the tree canopy coverage required in those places to maximise the livability and community benefits in the future. But taking a quick detour from the main structure of the strategy, I did want to alert you all to our one of our accompanying technical reports to the strategy, which was our Major Transport Program Assessment Report. And in this, we set out in quite a lot of detail our assessment of 6 major transport projects, which you see listed on your screen. And 4 of those we think stack up pretty well and are ready to move to the next phase of consideration. Obviously, all transport projects need to do detailed business cases before final decisions about proceeding are made, but we have firstly made a recommendation about proceeding with the City Loop Reconfiguration Project, which is a project which actually has benefits across the transport network and enables an uplift of capacity across the system, particularly to the northern growth areas and the regional communities beyond. Secondly, we've recommended a Western Rail Corridor upgrade, and indeed rail corridor upgrades also on the Wyndham Vale and Craigieburn lines to extend electrification of those corridors, allowing a capacity uplift, being cognizant of the future growth, population growth in those growth areas. Thirdly, we've made a recommendation about an outer metropolitan road and rail corridor. And this is a very long-term recommendation, but does connect the city right around, particularly for our freight network, and does join up a number of key freight facilities. It also improves flow across the road network and actually reduces congestion across the city. Finally, and riffing off the theme of better use and using the infrastructure we've got better, we have a recommendation about upgrading our road management systems. And our current systems are quite old and are not using the latest modern technology to coordinate the road system. So if we think about lane management, if we think about traffic light signalling, we can actually get quite a bit of improvement in traffic flow and usage of the road network by investing in the technology and the digital infrastructure we need to coordinate those systems better. As I've mentioned, we've also made a number of recommendations about freight, including connecting the potential new intermodal freight terminals with some of our major ports. And that includes both Melbourne Airport and Avalon Airport, and our seaports at the Port of Geelong, the Port of Melbourne, and a potential future port at Bay West. And our final theme, but certainly not the least of them, is around regional Victoria. And we've actually spent quite some time over the past couple of years really deeply engaging with some of the issues and communities in regional Victoria so that we could fairly and clearly reflect their needs in this strategy. And those have been themed around three main issues. The first is the economic development of the regions and really looking at how infrastructure can help leverage the economic advantage of different regions and help connect businesses to their consumers and markets. Secondly, we've looked at connectivity of the regions and particularly through transport connectivity and digital connectivity, giving people the access to the opportunities and the resources they need in their lives through infrastructure and improving that connectivity over time. And finally, we've looked at how infrastructure can help build regional Victorians' health, wellbeing and inclusion and meet many of the social needs that regional Victoria faces. So very quickly, we've made a number of recommendations about ensuring the road and rail networks in regional Victoria are well maintained and well planned and developed into the future. One thing we see is often, short-term stop-start maintenance and development projects. And what we very much encourage the Victorian Government to do is develop much longer term plans underpinned by funding security so that those networks can be maintained to set standards over the long term. We've also looked at some of the other economic opportunities in regional Victoria, and things like agriculture and tourism are both potential industries of future growth. So we've made recommendations about continuing to plan for better tourism facilities in the regions and ensuring that agriculture has the infrastructure, water supplies and energy supplies that it needs. Similarly, we do see renewable energy as a potential growth industry for the future and have made some recommendations about continuing to build the energy system in regional Victoria to leverage those opportunities. We've made recommendations about improving regional public transport and particularly focused in on the comparative inattention that local public transport networks have in the regions and really look encourage the government to look at how we can reshape local public transport networks, potentially leveraging off new technologies like on-demand services, and ensure that with local planning and local consultation, those networks can better meet local needs. We also look at improving digital technology in the regions, both increasing the resilience of the digital systems and using digital technologies to promote access to services. So for example, we've made a recommendation about using libraries to enhance digital access in places experiencing digital disadvantage. Similarly, we've looked at using some of the school digital resources to enhance access to services like telehealth. And we've also made a number of recommendations about upgrading and improving the social and community infrastructure in the regions. We are looking to encourage the government to work particularly with local governments and other local infrastructure owners to assess, improve, upgrade the local community infrastructure in those regions, because we're aware that a lot of it is often underutilised or in poor states of repair. And finally, we make a number of recommendations about social housing in the regions, about health facilities in the regions, and the range of social infrastructure the regions need to maintain their well-being into the future. So, alongside the strategy, so there's the main strategy, which we call Volume 1. There is also a second volume called Volume 2 with a number of technical appendices. And we've also authored 4 technical reports. One of those I've already spoken to you about, which is the Major Transport Program Assessment Report. We also have a second report entitled Driving Down Emissions, which actually provides a whole lot more detail on some of the work that we've done over the past year on the transition to zero emissions vehicles, including Victoria's largest deliberative engagement with over 200 Victorians from across the state, considering and discussing how Victoria can best transition to zero emissions vehicles. There's also a technical report which outlines our costings for the major transport projects and the detail that sits behind them. And finally, one of the models we developed for this strategy was a new model that can integrate transport and land use outcomes. So it actually, compared with traditional transport models, allows population and job movement in response to a transport project. And we have a detailed report there explaining the technical details of that model so that it's fully transparent and everyone can see the modelling technique that we've produced. Finally, I also want to draw your attention to our 9 regional profiles. So we have compiled, in consultation with the regions, a whole bunch of their feedback and how our strategy recommendations can apply and be adopted in all the different regions of Victoria. And finally, speaking of Volume 1 and Volume 2, one of the appendices in Volume 2 I encourage you to have a look at is our costing and funding report. And that has allowed us to estimate that all of our recommendations in total represent approximately 100 billion in capital infrastructure investment over the next 30 years. And we've set out the approximate profile of that investment, but do want to draw your attention to the fact that only 41 of our recommendations are actually capital investment by government, and 12 of those relate to upgrading or replacing existing infrastructure. Most of our recommendations are about better use and making the most of the infrastructure we've already got. So that is my very fast run through of the infrastructure strategy, but I'll hand it back to Michelle for some quick comments before questions.
Excellent, thank you very much, Llewellyn. So of course the question now is where to from now? It's a very simple answer. The Victorian government now has up to 12 months to respond publicly to our recommendations, but more importantly, provide all of us with their own vision on infrastructure with a 5-year infrastructure plan. But it doesn't stop there. By legislation, Infrastructure Victoria has got the obligation to independently assess this 5-year infrastructure plan, just to satisfy ourselves that it actually starts the process of delivering on the objectives and the vision that is reflected in the 3rd-year strategy we're presenting to you today. And we make that assessment publicly available in our annual report, which is tabled towards the end of September in Parliament. And on a regular basis, annually, starting with the annual report we will publish very soon, we undertake a progress, monitoring the progress for the Victorian government on infrastructure matters as reflected in the 5-year infrastructure plan. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there is a level of accountability and transparency that certainly is a way to make sure that collectively we progress towards delivering on the services that we all feel we need as reflected in the 3rd-year infrastructure strategy. So this is now time for your question. I'd like to acknowledge Maddie and Georgie, who are 2 key players in our communications teams. In fact, Maddie will facilitate the questions. And I'd like to invite Jonathan and Llewellyn to join us for the panel. If I could just remind you to type any questions you have into the discussion panel on the right-hand side of the screen. And don't forget to include your name and your organization so that Maddie can facilitate those questions as best as possible. On this note, over to you, Maddie.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to all those who have put questions in already. I'll put this first question to Jonathan, if I might. This one comes from Peter Hill, and he's just asking, how does the infrastructure strategy deal with the increasing role of the electrical grid in relation to moving away from fossil fuels and towards net zero?
Yeah, that's a great question, Peter. And so climate change and the transition of the energy sector is really front and center of the strategy. And so we've got a number of recommendations that talk about the key next steps as Victoria navigates that energy transition. So we think that there is a need to continue the what started in terms of renewable energy zones to identify and coordinate the development of those renewable energy zones. And that's really important both for continuing the decarbonisation of Victoria's energy system, but also for regional economic development too. It's a really key opportunity. What we do need to do though is make sure that that's well connected to the places that are going to be using that energy. So we have got recommendations about continued augmentation of the electricity transmission system, and so it can be resilient as well. There's another key part of this though, which you'll see a number of recommendations that are related to energy efficiency, because you know, we've got one of the ways we can go through this transition is to reduce our demand as well. So we're calling for high levels of energy efficiency when homes are built or renovated. We're calling for greater energy efficiency for rental homes and greater transparency around homes efficiency when they're sold, as well as calling for Victorian Government buildings to lift their load on energy efficiency as well. So that's a real sort of package of recommendations that we've got. The other thing I probably should mention is around zero emission vehicles, and Llewellyn's mentioned the work we've done there. Part of our recommendation there is for there to be a charging strategy developed and released. Partly that's about, well, where can we as consumers and drivers charge our vehicles, but also really important that the thinking is done around the electricity system to support that, and so that is keeping up with the demand that we're going to see for electric vehicles to be charged in coming years.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I think that actually addresses Peter's second question, which was actually relating to electric vehicles as well. And just the need to have multiple plugins at charging stations, and I'm assuming the strategy that you're referring to would deal with that issue.
Yeah, that's right, Maddie. We would think that that strategy should be clear about that. And to their credit, you know, industry and the commercial organisations that are starting to deploy increasing numbers of commercial charging stations are aware of that issue too.
Great, thanks for that. I might move on to Llewellyn, if I might. This question just relates to the 30% tree canopy recommendation. Perhaps you could just talk about the benefits of that, but also the question from Martin related to what about private land and private developers and investors?
Thanks for that, Maddie. So our recommendation about tree canopy cover is particularly targeted at growth areas, recognising that in established areas, local government also have the capacity to set tree canopy targets. But we're very aware that in the planning and rollout of a new growth area, there are a number of opportunities to use the planning system to require trees to be planted as part of the development. So that 30% target covers both public and private lands, and very much looks to leverage the planning system in the development of growth areas to require private lands to contribute towards that 30% target as well.
Excellent. I think that addresses Martin's question. A couple of transport questions now, and I'll throw this to Jonathan and then anyone else can chip in as well. But this one's from Michael Poultrin, and it's a question around the recommendation for the Western Rail Corridor, and it specifies Rockbank but doesn't address the growth in Melton. Can you talk to that, Jonathan?
Yeah, certainly. So we had a real look at the need for additional public transport services in the growing western Melbourne and the north as well, actually, both the existing demand and also projected future demands. And when we did our modelling and assessment of where that was going to be most effective as an investment, we are recommending that there be rail line extended from Sunshine to Rockbank, and part of what that is going to do is actually free up some of the demand that is currently on the line to Melton. And so that's our thinking in the first instance, is that that's where the emphasis should be. Our modelling showed that that's going to help with Melton line demand and also regional demand as well. So when we look at Ballarat, so it's not, when we've assessed where we should make changes to rail system, we've looked at both the people who might be using that new line or that new extension, but also the broader network effects that you get for other travellers across the network, be it the metro network or the regional network. And for a bit more detail on that analysis, what I'd recommend is to have a look at that major transport program assessment report that goes into quite a lot more of the detail on those modelling findings and our assessment of that.
Great, and I think that goes some way to answering Martin Chin's question, which was about the electrification of the Frankston line to Baxter and beyond. And I don't believe that's in the strategy recommendations at this point. Is that correct?
No, what we've done is we did look at a range of potential rail extensions in existing and growth areas, and there has been a need to prioritise those that we think are most in need of rail extensions, and where our preliminary assessment is that a business case is likely to stack up. We've identified some places like Frankston and Baxter where we think there is certainly opportunity to improve the service quality on the Frankston line through both incremental upgrades to that line, but also things like the City Loop reconfiguration will help with the Frankston line's reliability. When it comes to extensions beyond that, our recommendation in the first instance is to deliver really good, high quality, high frequency bus services to meet that need. And while that's being delivered, along with upgrades to the bus integration with the rail line in Frankston, that there should be further planning done for what the long-term solution would be to meet the travel demands beyond Frankston.
Excellent, thank you for that. Hopefully that answers your question, Martin. The next one actually comes from Graham McMillan, and it's also a transport program costing one. Jonathan, I am putting you on the spot here. Do you happen to know the discount rate that was applied in the major transport program costings?
I certainly do. It's a really good question, okay? And it's the way we've approached the assessment of transport projects is not to take one single cost or one single discount rate. We think it is more helpful and more mature to look at a range of costs and discount rates, because that gives both us as strategic planners and others who are needing to sort of further develop these as business cases a greater sense of the conditions under which a transport project is going to deliver real benefits. And you can see all of that transparently in our major transport program assessment report. So we have assessed projects at 4% and 7% discount rates, and we've also assessed them at a higher and lower cost ranges as well from our strategic costings, and that gives a band of those costs and cost benefit analysis. We have also done tests with higher and lower discount rates, with higher and lower costs, with different years that projects would open. So you can see all of that stress testing, if you like. But the short answer to the question is we've done it at 4% and at 7% is the key discount rates we've used. And we think that that's probably a helpful way to approach things.
Excellent, thank you for that. Michelle, I might throw this question to you. It comes from Tariq Munir from Swinburne Uni. She's just asking us about our approach to transport network pricing more broadly, and specifically what recommendations you have for Melbourne's network for road pricing and cordon-based, time-based pricing.
Now that's a good one. Our recommendation on pricing sit very neatly into the overall management of the demand on the network. And we consider that pricing can be a powerful signaling tool to inform someone to change their behaviors. And I would say that over the last 12 to 18 months, we've had collectively and individually a lot of opportunities to change some of our behaviors that we've had. So we do have some recommendations in there to within the next 5 years, recognizing that today might not be indeed the best time, but within the next 5 years, let's actually do a trial around the cordon pricing around the CBD. We're also very strongly putting forward a recommendation around putting in the new roads, and of course, you know, we've got Northeast Link and Westgate Tunnel, which are the first ones in the first cabs in the rank, to put some time of day pricing, which is the case already for Westgate Tunnel. Ultimately, the vision is to, at a point in time, move away from the fixed charges that we've got and have a system that recognizes how many kilometers you drive through a distance-based charge, but also when you decide to be there through a time of the day, which we feel is a much fairer and equitable way of actually recognizing the use of a limited asset, which is the road. The last point I would make is that whilst those recommendations around road pricing are important, they're just ingredients of a much more complex recipe, if you can allow me that French analogy. Because we got other ingredients in our 30-year infrastructure strategy. We're calling out for lower fares on buses and trams, because that is also a way of bringing people back onto the public transport. We're calling out, as Jonathan mentioned, for a ramp up of the services on buses with the next generation bus services. We're certainly very strong and active transport. We've got $900 million in the strategy just for better cycling and walking. When you put all that together, the recipe really that you get is a future where you are less dependent upon cars and better using cycling, walking, and the public transport. And we feel that this is a pretty compelling future to aim at, especially in the context of climate change and a better future for our children.
Thank you, Michelle. And that's a nice segue to the next question, which is climate related, and it comes from Nicola Waldron. Llewellyn, I'll ask you to answer this one if I can. How does the strategy consider planning for new infrastructure and the management of existing infrastructure, particularly in areas that may be increasingly vulnerable from the impacts of climate change, such as coastal areas and bushfire areas?
That's a great question. Thanks, Maddie. And so we actually have a section talking to this point. So we're very aware that it's been some time since there was a comprehensive assessment of the climate risks for Victorian infrastructure. The last one we're aware of was conducted in 2007. So we're recommending that we very much need to go back and do the thorough assessments of the climate risks to infrastructure, because the exact kinds of concerns that you've raised are becoming more and more apparent. So we need to be ensuring in the future that we're building infrastructure to the standard and in the locations that are going to be resilient to different climate futures. So we're very much recommending and encouraging the Victorian government to undertake the work required to identify those climate risks and be able to draw the conclusions to potential planning changes and policy changes that will help us ensure that we're building resilient infrastructure in the future.
Excellent, thank you for that, Llewellyn. The next question is from Bronwyn Clark at the National Growth Areas Alliance, and it's really relating to the role of local government in helping to roll out infrastructure in these growth areas. Llewellyn, perhaps you can address this question.
Sure, and we've actually made quite a number of recommendations about state government supports for local government in general and the growth area councils in particular in meeting the needs for infrastructure construction in the future. We're deeply aware that the scale of population growth in those areas is proceeding extremely rapidly, and the range of projections we have, whether we look for a low population growth or high population growth scenario, continue to grow really rapidly. So we've made recommendations firstly about monitoring that infrastructure need and this pace of delivery so that governments, both state and local, can be aware of the speed of infrastructure delivery and whether that's meeting the need. And secondly, we've made multiple recommendations about state government funding support for particular infrastructure types that are challenging to deliver given the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built in those locations and the limitations of local government budgets in those places.
Thank you. Thanks, Llewellyn. We've got time for some more questions, so keep them coming through. The next one is from Jackie Christacki from the Victorian Transport Action Group. And Jonathan, I might throw this one to you. It's really about the role of local transport in regional areas, but Jackie's question particularly relates to the school bus network and whether there's any opportunity to make better use of this grid.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Jackie. It's also very timely because Llewellyn and I and one of our colleagues gave evidence this morning to the parliamentary inquiry that's being currently conducted on that matter. So the transcript of that will be available fairly soon, I think, from the parliamentary website. The way we've looked at it is that regional public transport is one that is challenging compared to metropolitan transport, because you've got people with who often have relatively low levels of accessibility to transport, and are some of the more disadvantaged members of the Victorian community. So public transport is really important to them, but the distances and the number of people who use them is challenging. So we've identified that there is, of course, a range of different services that are being delivered in the regions, and for transport, and school buses is one of them, along with regular, if I can put it that way, public transport, and it's often through buses, but also sometimes there's on-demand services or council-delivered services or NDIS-funded services. So there's a range of them. And what we think is that we need to take one step back before we look just at school buses and look at the totality of what the priority public transport needs are in each regional area. And there should be engagement with the community about their transport priorities. And then I'll look at the range of already available services that could be used to meet that need. And we do think that school buses is part of that mix. And so that's what a real part of that. The other part is there is increasing opportunity with technology, as particularly the ability to use on-demand services through apps to meet some of the service needs for public transport in regional areas. So that's, if you like, the package of opportunities we think there are to improve regional transport services, using the transport vehicles that are already there and the funding that is already there to start with, to make sure we're getting the most out of it. And we think the school buses should be part of that mix when that's thought through.
Great, thank you. Llewellyn, this next question is back around the issue of tree canopy, but more specifically additional to tree canopy. What about green space and open space? How does the strategy talk about that issue?
Thanks for that, Maddie. So we make a recommendation about increasing not only the amount, but the connectivity of green space and open space, particularly in some of our established areas. So there's a range of mechanisms to do that. Firstly, looking at how we can integrate some of our open space and the connectivity of that open space with our active transport networks. So actually getting multiple benefits for both transport outcomes, for health outcomes, and for community outcomes. And then we look at, examining a number of the different mechanisms we can use to generate funding for that. So that's thinking about developer contributions, and we have a very old developer contribution system for open space, which we think deserves another look, as well as providing direct government funding from the Victorian Government to expand the amounts of open space and tree canopy across the city.
Great, thank you. Michelle, I'll put this question to you. This one's from Stephen Marshall. And it says, what consideration has there been in review of existing and ongoing major infrastructure projects in relation to the transport recommendations? And do you factor in considering changing any of the scope of these existing or ongoing major infrastructure projects?
Yeah, so this is a very important question to understand how we've approached the 30-year infrastructure strategy. We're very clear about our role, which is to make recommendations to the Victorian Government on the decisions they haven't made yet. which means that all of the commitments and decisions which we know about, whether it is a suburban rail loop or the airport rail link, the Westgate Tunnel, we take that as granted. That's going to be built, that's going to be delivered, and we've taken the best information possible in the base case to make sure that we were taking that into consideration as to whatever benefits they would deliver. When you do that, then you say, okay, well, what more is needed? What do we need to continue to advise the Victorian government to consider in order to supplement and complement the benefits that those already committed projects will deliver, but to provide more services in light of what the Victorians need in the next 30 years. So this is exactly what we've done. And if you take the 3 build projects out of the 4 which we forcefully recommend should proceed, they stand on their 3 feet. No matter what, to a certain extent. In fact, if you consider suburban rail loop to a certain extent, the uplift of services through the city loop reconfiguration or the Western Rail grade will actually enable to enhance the quality of the interchanges. If you think Frankston, for instance, or if you think Pakenham, and will actually contribute to benefit those projects which have already been committed. Another example which we've taken into consideration, for instance, are the level crossing removals. One of the beauty about really investing in road management systems enable to make sure that once that level crossing is being removed, there is actually coordination for you not to get stopped at the next traffic light, which is just 20 meters after the level crossing being removed. So that's really that sort of synergy, that sort of complementary approach that we've taken in regards to the major transport programs we've assessed, really taking into consideration without revisiting them or challenging them, because this is not the approach, to really forcefully come to the Victorian government and say, okay, knowing everything that we know, this is what more you need to deliver.
Excellent. I think we're getting towards the end of our time for questions, and I want to thank everyone for sending them through. Should we have one more before we wrap up? You happy with that?
Let's go.
I'll throw Alan Cowley's question into the mix, and I'll give this one to you, Jonathan, which is basically to do with the recent VAGO report and the finding that Victoria doesn't have an integrated transport strategy. I'm just wondering if you can talk to what the strategy has to say about that.
Yeah, sure. So we have a recommendation that the transport strategy be published, and also we've got a recommendation actually that some other sectoral strategies be published as well, not just transport, but other sectors that the Victorian government has responsibility for, things like schools, for example, or waste and recycling. But going back to the transport strategy, we have a similar view to the Auditor General, which is that there is value in publishing an infrastructure strategy for the transport sector, and that value is a few components to that. The analogy I would use is that if you're going to build a house, it really helps everyone who's contributing to building that house to be able to know what the plan is. And while bits of the plan might change sometimes, it's helpful to know what we're trying to achieve so that everyone can be pushing in the same direction. And so not every single bit of the transport system in the future needs to be pinned down, but to know what the key elements of it are, both in terms of the projects that will be built, but also any reforms to services or technology, is really important for others to help to support that. It also means that when we do land use planning, that we can know the way in which it's going to relate to the transport planning, so the two of them can work in concert. And it's also enables actors outside of the Victorian government to make their contributions. So it means that local governments can plan, knowing what the main transport planning intentions are, that businesses and community organisations can plan as well. So we think that there's real value in doing that, especially as Melbourne continues to grow, and we want to make the best out of our transport system and the investments that we make in it.
Thank you very much. And hopefully that answers your question, Alan. I'll hand back to you now, Michelle. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So this is the end of the session, but before we close, I would really want to acknowledge the extraordinary work delivered by my colleagues at Infrastructure Victoria under very challenging circumstances to produce this strategy. Every word you will read in the volume 1, the volume 2, or the assessment report has been written by one of them. And I have to admit, personally, I'm in awe with what they've actually accomplished, and hopefully you will share that feeling when you read the reports. By all means, go on our website and make the most of all of those reports that are available there. It's part of our transparency, it's part of sharing the evidence, it's part of nurturing and informing the debate. No matter what areas you're interested in or working on, you're likely to find something, some fresh evidence, some fresh modeling results that is there to your benefit. And that's really saying that we see this release of the 30-year strategy not as a tick in the box exercise and then that's it. It's really the beginning of an engagement and a discussion. It's really making sure that all of this evidence that is now publicly available is there, and that we can continue the ongoing dialogue with you to make sure that those recommendations are live, and that the government, in the context of preparing for their own response, benefits from this ongoing engagement and debate on no matter what infrastructure sectors it might be. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me really thank you for your attention today. It's certainly been a pleasure to produce this strategy and now share it with you. We certainly take continuous improvement very seriously at Infrastructure Victoria, so if you could please take some time to fill in the survey, the short survey that you'll receive, that will enable us to really take that into consideration for the next event. And let me again, close this session by thanking all of you. These are difficult times. There's never been a more important time to have some sort of clarity and visibility as to what the future might be. Hopefully and humbly, this 30-year infrastructure strategy, with all of your input into it, will enable us collectively as Team Victoria to get a little bit of that certainty. So please stay safe, look after yourself, and again, thank you very much for being with us today.